You're watching LMCC.
Hello and welcome to Talking Points, a community education program. The League of Women Voters of South Tonka and the Lake Minnetonka Communication Commission are partnering to bring you this program. I'm Peg DuBoard. I'm with the League of Women Voters South Tonka, and today we are going to be talking about gun violence and the League of Women Voters Minnesota study on firearms. On the panel today are Cindy Holker, who is from the South Tonka League, and Marty Mix, who is the co-chair of the study and a member of the Golden Valley League of Women Voters. Our goal with this presentation today is to educate the audience on the major issues involving gun violence today and to share with you the results, some of the highlights of the study that is being completed by the League of Women Voters on firearm safe violence. So with that, Marty, what was the reason that the League of Women Voters Minnesota started the study?
Well, every other year, the leagues in Minnesota look at the position statements of all the different things that we've studied in the past. And 5 leagues proposed that we update the firearms study. That was the most of the leagues that, chose that one because they felt the language was very outdated. And, we thought, well, yeah, there's been some new court cases. We didn't think it would be as complex as it was. And as we got into it and we learned the drastic changes that had occurred in the 30 years since the position was taken, we really needed to do a consensus study because we needed to add more positions.
Okay, hey, can you explain how was the study conducted? I think there was two parts to it.
Yeah, we did 2 parts. We were doing the research, and then as we were looking at the research, we wanted to know, geez, is this accurate information we're getting? Do our police departments report to the FBI? Little things like that. And, what is the impact of firearms in our communities? And we learned a tremendous amount by interviewing the local police chiefs and the sheriffs of the counties. And no, we did not reach all of them, but we did. We have 35 local leagues and about 30 different, I think we had 39 police chiefs and sheriffs that were interviewed.
I bet that was interesting information.
It was very interesting. And by the way, we learned that all the police departments report their statistics to the BCA. So we started just doing a ton of research. And we kind of broke it up into sections, so we were each experts in our own sections.
Great.
Marty, can you tell our audience about how the Second Amendment has changed in the past 20 years?
Yes. For more than 200 years, the right to bear arms under the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution received little attention in either legislature or the courts. When it was discussed, the amendment was interpreted as a collective right, relating to the militia, and it was understood that states and federal government were free to regulate private ownership of firearms. But a major shift occurred when the District of Columbia et al. V. Heller case was decided. And what it determined was it was more of a historical originalist approach to jurisprudence this time. It established an individual right, but not an absolute right, to keep and bear arms. And it directly states that the right is not unlimited. So you can create certain categories that are ineligible to get firearms if they're viewed as dangerous. It also states that all of these arms, even those that were not in existence at the time of the founding, would be included. So all of our updated firearms are assumed that are the same ones we have a right to. And it notes a historical tradition of prohibiting dangerous and unusual weapons while protecting those arms in common use at the time. So there is some room for some kinds of decisions that states can make. So it's not absolute that everyone can have a gun.
Great. Another reason for the lack of information on gun violence was the Dickey Amendment. Can you explain how this hindered the research?
Yeah, the Dickey Amendment basically said that it pretty much stopped all research because there was such fear that if any research found that there could be advocating for any kind of gun regulations, they didn't want to see anything like that coming out of it. So the researchers were so concerned that their research might be used for advocating for gun restrictions that they just basically didn't do any research. And then recently the Congress did say, yeah, well, they allocated $25 million for research. And it is basically to say, though, you still can't use that for advocating for gun restrictions.
In your study, what were the reasons that you found for gun death?
You know, that was the biggest surprise for me. I assumed it was homicides, and suicides are the largest number of gun deaths that we have in our country. And in fact, in Minnesota, in 2019, it was 77% of all gun deaths were suicides.
So I think there's kind of a misconception that, we have more gun violence now than we've ever had. And so what did the data bear relative to that?
Yeah, because when you look at the data and you see the numbers are going up each year, you think, oh, this is just horrendous. And yet when you look, you think, oh my gosh, our country has grown a tremendous amount. So we have actually a lower rate of violence than we had at the peak in the mid-1990s. However, it is going up, and in some cities, it's starting to reach that. It's not quite there, but it is definitely a concerning trend that we have now in firearm violence. It had been going down.
So where does the most gun violence happen, or gun?
You know, and it depends if you're looking at homicides or suicides. If you look at Wyoming, which is really, on that slide there, the darker it is, the more gun deaths. And Wyoming's gun deaths are a very high suicide rate. And if you look at Alaska, it is a high homicide and a high suicide rate. I think Alaska is.
And then on that chart too, the East Coast seems to have a lower death rate for gun violence. And why do you think that is?
Well, you know, we can't tell, we don't have statistics on causation, but for correlation, the states in the Northeast tend to have stricter gun laws. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts. And they also, Massachusetts specifically, has some, not only the gun regulations, but programs to support those who are depressed and suicidal. They have more money that they fund for mental health services.
Oh, that's interesting.
Marty, can you tell us about the current Minnesota firearms laws, and maybe, again, kind of correlating it back to this chart, why Minnesota may be sitting a little bit lower than the vast majority of the states?
Right, and one thing I was going to mention, on the other map, Maine was not quite as low a homicide, or as low a firearm rate as some of the other, as like New York and New Jersey. But Maine also has very few gun restrictions. They have a high gun ownership rate. So there's a correlation between a high ownership of guns and firearm mortality.
And then how about Minnesota's current laws?
Yeah, Minnesota doesn't have a lot of regulations, but as I look at them, we've actually done some very strategic regulations. One of them is requiring, if a person is to get a semi-automatic military-style assault weapon, they have to get a permit to purchase. And you have to have a permit to purchase to get a handgun. And those require then background checks, which would then end up with some kind of a waiting period. Within 7 days, the local police chief has to determine whether the permit to purchase should be given or not. Another one that Minnesota has that is helpful is a negligent storage law. Not that it has a lot of teeth in it, but at least a gun shop with our licensed dealers, they have to post that you need to keep your guns locked away from children. You don't want anyone under 18 accessing your firearms. And more recently, though, we do have the permit to carry. Now, we are a shall issue state, which now the Supreme Court ruled that all states shall not limit who gets a permit to purchase based on showing need for carrying a gun. But Minnesota requires that if you get a permit to carry, that you pass a firearm certification training test, and there's a background check, and it's much more in depth than the sheriff does that, in that they have 30 days to go through all of a person's records to determine whether they should have a permit to carry.
One of the things that amazed me, Marty, as I was looking at your statistics, since that law was passed, there's 358,000 valid permit holders in Minnesota.
And that did not, in our interviews with police and sheriff, they were not thrilled with the increase in those who have permits to carry, because that means you have a lot of people out on the street who may not be very good at, at aim. They might kill a lot of innocent bystanders. Or just, if you're in a bad mood, use that gun for the wrong reasons. In states where, like, stand your ground laws they have a higher rate of homicides, because people are more likely to use the gun when
they feel threatened.
When they feel threatened.
Yeah.
Even though they may not be.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you touched really briefly on the most recent Supreme Court ruling as it related to the state of New York. Can you give us a little bit more detail on that? And I know it didn't directly impact Minnesota, but...
No. New York was a state that from 1913 on, if you wanted a permit to carry, you had to show a need for it. And if you didn't have a need for the permit to carry, you couldn't get it. Well, this went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that states cannot do that kind of law, even though this was a law that had been in existence for over 100 years. And that's really a strong precedent, but they overruled that.
And Minnesota has never had the law that you have to prove a reason.
Actually, we did.
We did.
We did at one time in 2003, and then there was a strong lobby group to end that, and so then we became a shall issue state.
Okay, thank you. Do police shootings only occur in urban areas?
Oh no. In fact, they actually, I think, more occur in other counties than in Hennepin or Ramsey County. And it's not like, I think we had 11 killings by police in the whole state of Minnesota. And they were, one in each county or municipality. And so it's just 11 municipalities or counties that had that.
And that's kind of the headline is always all the police shootings. And, the data, at least for Minnesota, speaks that that's not necessarily true, and it's not necessarily an urban issue.
Exactly. Yeah, but I think that when people are, when there's a mental health crisis, sometimes they're acting strange, and they don't know what to do, and so I think there's more of a reaction. So there has to be more training on how to handle mental crises.
Did your study? This is a little off the topic, but did your study talk about police doing crisis intervention training and de-escalation training?
Yeah, you know what? I think that's been more recently where the post board required that. But yes, there had been some of that. The one thing we did find is that almost every single department that we interviewed did have training on how to handle domestic violence. So that was an important one. Right,
which is a scary situation for police intervention.
It can be one of the more lethal positions that a police can be in.
So, true or false? Do most mass shootings occur in schools?
No, but if you're looking at the headlines, you'd think so.
Right.
With mass shootings, what's very difficult about that for researchers is it's defined differently by so many different groups. So we don't have a one clear definition of what is a mass shooting. Gun Violence Archive says a mass shooting is 4 or more shot. But if you look at one group, every time they say 4 or more killed, excluding the shooter. FBI has 3 or more shot. So it varies. And what they do find, and if the FBI has a distinction in that an active shooter has to be outside in a public area, so they don't count the domestic violence. And surprisingly, I learned that most mass shootings are in the home. And it can be a domestic. It could also be where someone's coming to get drugs. So it's a criminal thing, revenge, but they go to the home or in that neighborhood, at the backyard, that kind of thing. Okay. And then the next highest group are in the public areas that have more traffic. It can be businesses, which is the next highest, and of course, shopping malls and such, and then in schools.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, do rural counties have higher suicide rates of gun suicide, higher rates of gun suicide than urban counties?
They tend to. Those that have, that are farther away from services. What surprised me is that there is a statistic that I think I wanted to remember to bring out, and that is the ratio of mental health providers in the rural area. There's only one provider for every 1,518 people in greater Minnesota, whereas in the metropolitan area, there's one provider for 304 people. Wow. So there's a huge gap, and of course there's a lot of push for trying to get some services. A lot of more veterans live out in the greater Minnesota area, percentage-wise, and the highest suicide rate is white males, and that's, again, they're more greater Minnesota. And Native Americans also very high for suicide rates.
So, is it true that having a gun in the home increases the likelihood of being killed?
Yes, it certainly does. And it's not just, domestics that could lead to a homicide, but it's also the suicides. It's the access that children might get to a gun. It's that maybe that person who's very angry with you and they know you have a gun and they can, if you're in close proximity, they can get that gun away from you. And it's, we've seen cases where they just turn it against the family. So.
And that stat is 70% higher with a gun in the house.
Yeah, yeah.
Does all the gun violence happen in the urban areas?
If we're talking gun violence like homicides, much more so in the urban areas. If we're talking suicides, more so in the rural areas.
Okay. What about, I think there's some data that says that over 90% of cities in Minnesota have no firearm homicides in a given year.
Right. That was one of the things that when we were doing the interviews, we were thinking, are the police chiefs being truthful that they have not had a murder in their city? And then I was going through and looking at the statistics, and sure enough, there is over 90% that did not have any homicides that they experienced.
Okay. And then here's the last one. Is the rate of firearm violence greater than ever before? I think we talked about that a little bit, but...
No, it's not as great as it was in the mid-90s.
But it's getting there.
Mm-hmm. And in the mid-90s, we had that huge crime bill that put millions of dollars out there to do things like... obviously getting more police on the streets, but more importantly also getting the gun intervention violence programs going.
And is that at the same time where there was the assault on...
And there was the ban on assault weapons. Yes, yeah, there was a real movement in the whole country. We've got to do something. And I think we're getting at that point again where we have to do something. And I think with the fact that Congress even had passed that bipartisan bill.
Just lately,
on gun regulations, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing some of that research, Marty. Can we shift to your interviews with law enforcement?
Sure.
Part of your study focused on those interviews. Can you tell us a bit about those interviews? Can you tell us what are the areas that are the majority of the respondents could agree on during those interviews?
Right, yeah. Obviously, every police chief had a different view, but certain things they did have agreement on. The strongest agreement came out that they believed that there should be universal background checks. And when I say universal, that means currently with the Brady gun law, there has to be a background check when a federally licensed dealer sells the gun to you. But, if you had a gun, you could sell me your gun and you may not know what my background is. And this, if you do universal background checks, when you do a gun purchase and you are not a licensed dealer, you could go to a licensed dealer, and one of the dealers I talked to said it takes about 2 minutes to do the FBI check, but at least it's a way to have some kind of check on that person, because they might be coming, like they said, sometimes you get somebody from another state, and Minnesota may not know that they're a felon in another state, but when they do that FBI check, they're able to pick it up right away.
And so with universal background checks, with that, how does that work when you have somebody that's buying a weapon for somebody who shouldn't have a weapon?
That's what's called a straw purchase. And that was another thing that the police talked to us about, which I'd never heard of before. And that is a concern. And of course, there's concern about gun trafficking as well. And they're starting to look at certain gun dealers are maybe not as honest as others. But it's more in the unlicensed area. There's an example when we talk about ghost guns. These are guns that can be, they're self-manufactured at home, and you don't have to have any background check for it. And yet it may only take you an hour to do all the drilling to complete that receiver or frame that you've received that's already kind of pre-made, 80%.
So universal background checks was the first thing
yes.
that there was
the only
agreement
thing
on.
that the police had some concern. They said, if it's family like Grandpa giving his son a gun, he didn't think that should. They didn't think that was as big of a deal. But it's all these transactions that people are doing on the streets, et cetera.
Yeah, it's really hard to sort of kind of wrap your head around, how that would all work. I'm sure people have thought about that, but just in the situation of a gift kind of thing rather than a purchase, and how that would all work. But I'm sure there's ways to make it happen.
And the one thing and it's not just the purchase, but also the transfer. Sometimes they'll say, they'll get around it by saying, I didn't buy it. It is just, we just traded it. Because that also happens with the trading of the firearms.
Good.
And then
go ahead.
Yeah, and then the next highest one was the extreme risk protection orders, or called red flag laws. And that is when a person's a danger to themselves or to others. And what this does is it actually would have the gun removed from the home. And of course, in talking to the police, they're saying, you really have to be careful how you write the law. You want to make sure that you protect due process, but at the same time, you have to. And also, a lot of them are saying, where do we store the guns? They're worried more about those details of how it's actually going to play out.
The logistics of it all.
And whereas, and they're trying to figure out, could the family get the person out of the house? All these kinds of logistical things that they were really looking, how could you implement it? But they did support that concept because they saw, especially in the rural areas, domestic abuse can be higher there. Right. Yeah. And then the final one, where it was more about how we asked the question, which didn't quite get at it, but what clearly came through when we asked about, should there be training before a person purchases a gun? And they're saying, on the first purchase, so, if it's a young kid, you want to make sure they're very aware of how the hunting licenses are done. So it'd be something like that, the training that you get when you have a hunting license. They felt that would be helpful for youth. And they said, and a couple said, maybe a refresher course for older people, but for the most part, they just really wanted that first-time gun purchaser.
Well, when you think about it, I know the correlation between, a new driver, and having to go through training. I mean, my grandson just had to do 50 hours of training before he could, get his license. Yeah. So, it just makes sense for something that's as lethal potentially as a gun, to have some sort of training relative to the operation of that gun.
Yeah. Just one more question about the actual interviews. Were your interviewees cooperative? They were happy to share their perspective. Was there any hesitancy at all?
There was, because a lot of the interviews are done after the George Floyd killing. Mm-hmm. And so there was certainly some concern about people from the public. And yet, once, everyone said that they really appreciated doing the interviews. That was one thing that they really loved, and they didn't think they would. And the police chief at first might be a little hesitant and not as open, and then by the end of the interview, they're sharing their total thoughts. So it was really very, very nice.
Yeah,
great.
Oh, awesome. So kind of just kind of a wrap up kind of thing. Tell us if there's anything that the study that you think is outcomes of your study? What do you think is going to happen? Anything else that you want to share with us relative to the study? Kind of how, what your thoughts are might be relative to that.
There's kind of a high bar. We want to make sure that we have at least 70% of all of our leagues participating, hopefully 80, 90%. And we also want to make sure that at least, the 80% support whatever position is. So it might not be everything that we would like to see, but the one thing is the extreme risk protection orders, I think, is really, if we have the Minnesota police chiefs favoring that, and we can see that in the studies that it can save lives, that's a really important one. And then for me, I really want to see more evidence-based gun violence intervention programs being supported. Right now you'll get the support, but the funding might disappear the next year, or they'll just say, well, things are looking better, and they kind of forget that there is a underlying causes. So we want to make sure, especially that our young males are involved in things that are training or school, or just keeping them on more positive trajectory rather than just focusing on social media disputes that end up in firearms.
Marty, has there been any efforts to open up that research? Remember, we talked about the fact that the results of research on gun violence can't be utilized to lobby. Has there been efforts to change that dynamic? Not really.
Well, it's got to pass both houses of Congress.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that I'm feeling positive. One thing though that came as a surprise in the study was, although I'm so concerned about firearm deaths, I was shocked at the number of deaths with drug overdoses and fentanyl and things like that. And there is also a connection with that and also firearms, because there can be more use of firearms and suicides when they are addicted to drugs, etc.
Great. Well, that kind of wraps up our conversation about gun violence and the study that the League of Women Voters Minnesota has undertaken to update their positions on firearms. So I'd like to thank Marty. Marty's the co-chair of that study, and I know you've spent the last couple of years involved in doing it, and it's been hard. Hard but exciting, I think it's been fulfilling in some ways. It's been great information.
It has been.
And then I'd like to thank Cindy for helping on the panel. Finally, I'd like to thank the Lake Minnetonka Communication Commission for partnering with us as to be able to present this program. And just a little bit about the League, for those of you who are not familiar with the League of Women Voters. For 103 years, the League has been involved in building strong communities whose efforts began with the struggle to obtain women's right to vote. Membership is available to all individuals 16 and older. We encourage men to be part of the League of Women Voters, and in fact, we have men presidents of the League of Women Voters in our local league, so that's a plug for any of the men in the audience who would like to become involved. Don't be afraid. The League of Women Voters is nonpartisan, and what that means is that we do not support political parties nor candidates. We arrive at positions based on studies such as the one that Marty has just talked about, and they're based on factual information shared with our membership in a consensus process. So during the consensus, the potential positions are voted on, and with majority consent are adopted as our official positions on issues presented in the study. Following the adoption, these positions are then used to advocate for change at the local, state, and federal levels, and by hosting events such as talking points. The programs are part of the League's mission, and to learn more about the League of Women Voters South Tonka, go to our website at League of Women LWV southtonka.org. And finally, I'd like to just thank everybody for participating, and LMCC for helping us with the program.